try here?
Also,
Good. Okay. So we now should be there.
hm,
And we're in the session, especially dealing with the arts, but more generally consumption and policies connecting with the arts, through the arts, mediated by the arts, as this is one of the major findings of our scenes work. I wasn't teaching any section on arts at all 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I taught urban, I taught finance, I taught city money and so forth, urban public finance, political system, etc. But the arts only came in when we discovered it empirically, inductively, to our surprise. Um, and I've gone over that before in other sections earlier. I won't review that historical background in that specific way we discovered it, except to remind you that it wasn't something that I came, for instance, from having been an art historian or, hugely focused on the arts. Okay. Since then, finding that, I mean, I had enjoyed the arts on a personal level, um, but I hadn't really incorporated that in my social science in a more integral manner. And so I'll also add, grown up in an economics background, I was much more conscious of. And when I came to the university here with a PhD, I started immediately going to some workshops in economics with leaders. Then were Milton Friedman, George Stigler, and then a few years later, Gary Becker came back here. So I saw the change that Gary Becker brought in this department and has seen that transforming the entire discipline of economics, even though we have a couple of two or three themes which I want to introduce to try to not to do too many things in this one session. But this is essential to try to see the changes within the discipline of economics generally and the transformations in life surrounding the university, surrounding these countries. China and the US are just part of the world, and where and why these things are being transformed. These in turn, if we ignore them, we simply have increasingly abstract and empty models in the sense of not fitting with our empirical surroundings. So how can we do this? How can we, that is, on the other hand, we don't want to go so far as to become journalists or biographers. And we want to do this in a way that we're doing some social science, and some steps in this direction are to have some core concepts and to try to use those in an explicit, consistent manner. And then to follow what philosophers of science talk about as having interrelated bodies, connections of propositions, which in turn can be derived. If x leads to if x1 leads to x2 and x2 leads to x3, where does y intervene and potentially shift and mediate? That's the big term here. How does the relationship between x, y, and z get mediated by having a third variable? So it's not as if we should only talk about the arts or something is added as a new variable. Often the arts, if we then begin to use that term in different ways, we can say where and how the world around us with a sensitivity to arts does that change? Does that change television? Does it change advertising? Does it change reading the Bible? And the Bible, in that sense, is a work of art as well as a work of theology, as work of other things. So I'm making another point here, which I've made through the course, which is the idea of distinguishing between an empirical phenomenon like a city government. When you say the city, or let's say city, a city can be, that's a very vague term, but it can be defined operationally, for instance, as the city of Chicago, to mean the governmental structure within following the laws and regulations of the state of Illinois and within the federal system of the US. That's the legal answer. If in turn we may want to say, look at a philosophical sub-theme within philosophy, which is where and how do aesthetics play a role and where are they important? And the critical finding over the last couple of centuries, I'll just introduce from the standpoint historically, as I've mentioned, the Germans developed a sense of of uh, an aesthetic um, nationalism, which is also a cultural that is a what makes the what was the definition of Germany in 1830? It was defined by Goethe, by artists, by music, by Wagner. It was not defined by the political leaders because Germany was a fragmented set of duchies and princes and so forth. Germany was nationalized as a state by Bismarck and others around 1870. They fought against the French, and that was a unifying national activity, where the Germans really beat the French in a dramatic way that transformed and led in turn to World War I. But my simple point is the first step was the philosophers, the artists, Goethe, um, music. These were the things which defined German identity, and more generally, the concept of culture as a national meaning was widely used for the definition of culture around 1830 when Tocqueville first came here. So people were talking about culture, they would mean, oh, so you mean English culture or you mean French culture. So that's what culture meant. France is different from Italy, is different from Germany, and that was the early core meaning of culture and of political culture in that very clear sense. As we move into the 21st century, we now have many different subtypes. So just one big one, which came in the 19th, was the emergence of the national culture simultaneously by especially people like Wagner. You had Romanticism, and in France, the counterpart was Bizet. And so a romantic conception of music is not to have simple Mozart, Bach, Beethoven type structured, linear, if you will. Max Weber himself used music as a classic example of rationality and of science when he wrote the book Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. So he used music and musical structure in the sense of the Western music, and he didn't pay attention to Wagner when he wrote about this sentence, at least. He had in mind Mozart, Beethoven. Okay, the Wagner brought to this the sense of subjectivism. That is, music is not just what is written out on the score, that there are certain numbers of notes which you pick up a piano or you play a recorder, another kind of instrument, you can play those notes. Wagner didn't pay attention to that. Those were a means, and the definition of what structured music for Wagner was the feelings inside the individual. That was a revolution. And so you didn't have the beginning or the end in four parts, for instance, of a symphony or something like that. Instead, the scenes which were created by Wagner could be a scene where two men are fighting and the scene ends as soon as one is killing the other. And that's the end of it. In that way, the action, the feelings about, oh my God, our hero is dead, Siegfried is destroyed. Okay, so in that sense, the why was this so important? Because in this example, just to add one more sentence, what's the big story of Wagner in his four works called The Ring was that his wife said, you were playing around with those earthlings and you have children on earth now. You must end that. And he said, well, I'll give you a whole new castle. So he did. He built Valhalla, and that was their castle for all the royalty. But she then said, you must kill all of your earthling children. And so he resisted, but he did. And so the tragedy of all four is how these four children were killed by their own father because his wife is saying this is sinful. Okay, so in that sense, this, if you will, is about feelings and morality in that kind of Protestant sense of what's right or wrong, in the sense of looking outside the individual for sources of happiness or a so-called Benthamite definition of happiness. But this also challenges the widespread economic use of the term utilitarianism, which in turn leads to the definition of economic maximization of preferences as a simple definition of what is economics. It's not about money, it's not about banks, it's not about being rich or poor. It's about the maximizing utility subject to constraints. And that's the analytical definition of economics. Okay. What I'll then add to that briefly is to say there are some that this is a major, wonderful, important department of economics here because it has gone through huge changes, but we also have, and I will mention here, Bill Landis, was an economist here who was also chairman of the collections committee of the Smart Art Gallery here at the University of Chicago. Landis grew up in Greenwich Village, surrounded by New York artists, and he loved it as a kid before he became an economist. But he continued collecting a lot of art himself, and then continued that in writing and doing some research as a scholar. Uh, a second is David Galenson, full professor of economics here. He started earlier more in the history of economic theory, but he then moved into pricing and markets of paintings, like especially Picasso. So he studied, and he said to me once, for instance, I want to link this to innovation because this is what is the core of many aspects of economic growth. And so this was from Schumpeter, this is from Jane Jacobs. Many others have made this kind of point, but linking this in turn to the arts is a big step in the 21st century, not just because this is deductively imposed, but because this is happening. This message has also then reached, going through economists, philosophers. Let me bring in artists themselves, painters, musicians. The painters at the Art Institute, for instance, um, not just the art, there's a leader, a world leader there, but they are doing public art in the last 20 years or so. Public art is not on one painting on the wall. A public art is to have a many mile long activity. And I have a cousin of mine who's a choreographer, and she has organized, apparently, she claims on her website, the largest public art activity, which went from Minneapolis down to New Orleans. That is, the entire Mississippi River was connected via dancers. dancers dancing simultaneously, listening to the same music, which they had on recording, so they could listen simultaneously and dance up the whatever over roughly 1,000 miles of one river, showing where and how these things would connect. um, I'm mentioning these two, and I'll mention David Landis, for instance, as um, an illustration under the leadership of Gary Becker, who, when he came back, organized an interdisciplinary workshop. And it was an extension of what I went to earlier, used to be Friedman and Stigler, a sort of general, including all, that is the economists, sorry, the workshops, which now define one of the most brilliant distinctive things about the University of Chicago is these workshops engage the faculty with each other to talk, argue, disagree, innovate, challenge, etc., in ways that bring different faculty together. And it started with Friedman and Stigler. It then is generalized in all the fields, or let's say most of the fields, but certainly in social science and in the social science and the humanities. And this brings together and I'm pointing now to the arts, as well as including Gary Becker's mathematical economics. And I'll add the adjective mathematical was not part of economics in the 1930s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. Okay, so I'm introducing these multiple analytical perspectives. And I'm contrasting here to simplify a bit, focus especially in the US and England. 1920s and 30s, a leading figure was John Maynard Keynes. Keynes in turn became more important when Roosevelt became elected president of the US. He invited Keynes to come several times to the US. Most important was after the war, they said the Bretton Woods meetings in New Hampshire. They held and Keynes was a leading figure in conjunction with that globally. So my point is, Keynes himself in the 1920s and 30s also supported the Bloomsbury Press, which published works of artists, writers, literary people, in conjunction with best-selling people like Virginia Woolf. He was a close friend of Keynes. And these people brought together a style of bringing economics to the more general public in a clear literary classic English way of speaking. A young guy, one day I was coming home in Chicago. I looked down and I saw the newspaper, and it said, Gary Boy wins Nobel Prize. I said, what's this? Gary Boy wins Nobel Prize? Paul Samuelson, who grew up in Gary, Indiana, was named the first economist in the world to have a Nobel Prize. Wow. Okay. So that's the local connection, if you will. Why did he get the Nobel Prize? I'd say two simplifying things. One, he mathematized economics. He transformed most of what people who were writing and thinking they were doing good economics. Samuelson said, no, you've got to have solid math. Second, he brought in a whole series of concepts. He wrote a best-selling, brilliant introductory textbooks, became the most widely used introduction to economics. All of economics is laid out there very clearly and simply for, first year, second year, third year college students around the world, and was brilliantly simply done. But he then wrote a Foundations of Economics book, which was all about using math. And then one of the most dramatic things was to say what were things which also dealt with the role of collective decisions. What's that? That could be government. That could be things which he then went back to the two concepts from just stay with the late 19th century, the late 1930s English version was the welfare state. And several people at the London School of Economics were actively conferring with how to build a welfare state, defining what is right, wrong, good, bad. And it tended to use something like counting the number of people who felt these would be more satisfied if this was a good policy. This is the Jeremy Bentham simple definition of utilitarianism. Samuelson, as a young Turk, went to London and said, and he had these brilliant older senior economists in the front row, and he said to them, "You guys are wrong. You don't understand. You say you're doing welfare economics. You don't understand what that is, and you're missing the boat because you're not connected to the way economics really works." And he then laid this out, and he introduced a fundamental concept of the public good. That analytical term is used today around the world. Samuelson invented there. And the key point which he made was to say a public good is something which is generally shared, like clean air or war or peace, at the same time that there are high, that is, they're very high exclusion, or it may be impossible to exclude people from accessing it. So those two definitional aspects are analytical. These are not, say, um, a public good is what a government does. That's not. So they're two things, and we use both in this course. We've read, what does a mayor do? What does a city government do? What does the happens in Washington with Trump and so forth? That's politics for sure, but that's not the definition of a public good, which is not and also it's not necessarily good in the moralistic sense. It can be a public bad in the sense of dirty air or being at war for people in the wrong side of battles. And so the public good concept roughly simultaneously was not developed, but was considered along by Kenneth Arrow. Arrow was also here at Chicago, Arrow, and he worked on the idea of how can we make collective decisions in ways that are consistent with the core ideas of economics. And the simple corollary conclusion of these two guys was what has been termed an impossibility theorem. And the bottom line was politics cannot be analyzed using economic tools as normally analyzed by market type Adam Smith economics. And what that led was to economists for roughly a couple of decades stopped talking about politics and budgets and governmental processes. And so that, in a sense, this was the nihilism which Samuelson took to that front row of people at LSE, that, you guys are wrong. You can't do this. What you're doing is just telling him what you think is good. What you're doing it in some way that it's in your head, but we don't know where it came from, and you shouldn't call it economics at all. Okay, in a sense, that's a strong impossibility theorem that you can't really do this in terms at least of the getting a supply and a demand and at least over time, a longer term equilibrium position where the price is set and matching the quantities available of supply and demand. Okay, so that core ideal of markets in this section of the course I'm introducing as a clear normative, and this classic definition is distinguished between the normative and the positive types of economics, and they both are clearly visible, active, but they may have overlapping criteria in this sense of saying this doesn't work if we try to do this for politics. A couple of decades later, a Chicago economics graduate came back here. Uh, uh, and he was talking about politics. And the this happened in the late 60s when we had a division within the social sciences, sharpened, if you will, to simplify, between a group that moved toward Marx, social criticism, and you had more strongly represented by anthropologists, some geographers, some architects, some sociologists. On the other hand, some people who went the other way said, we don't want to do this. We want serious mathematical work. We want to be more rigorous. And so that led to another group which moved in that direction. And within the discipline of political science, those people who wanted to be more mathematical said, let's let's find a way of doing somehow, which is politics, but let's give it a new name. And so they called it public choice, or sometimes called it social choice. And that then dominated a lot, continuing more at Stanford, more at certain other places, uh, in the core of a focus on um, aspects of that is of abandoning the focus on interest groups, which was the salience of Chicago earlier in political science. And in the 20s and 30s, the whole discipline of political science emerged here in contrast to the European greater focus on socialism and building the welfare state. The interest group focused more on I won't try to summarize so much as to say it with Dahl, we read it. With Stone, we saw aspects of that, and then battles over how to build a more economic approach. And one figure was in Anthony Downs, who was an assistant professor here in economics, and his economic theory we talked about in this course, and it ideally framed political elections as the counterpart of the market, and the dynamic of competition between two or three candidates could in turn lead to new policies being innovative if they are then rewarded and they are responsive to citizens as qua voters. So in that sense, this Downsian definition of an economic theory of democracy, which was the title of his book, um, uh, was a major force in conjunction with Buchanan and Tulloch. So James Buchanan was the Chicago economist by training, and when I was saying he came back at one point, I had a dinner with him. There was a big table in the Quadrangle Club, probably 25 people, 30 people. They were all the economists from the University of Chicago were sitting at the table, and across from me was James Buchanan, and no one else was very close. I was shocked that that uh, uh, no one spoke with him. I went with a workshop which he put on, and Milton Friedman showed up with his mail, and he was opening his mail while Buchanan was presenting to the workshop. I mean, quite an insulting thing to do. But my point was this was this was a definition that we're not doing this. It was a sharp definition between the older generation of Milton Friedman with Stigler in part, with then Gary Becker, and then in turn, Becker in turn has enough confidence to and enough brilliance, which economics had or has achieved, that he was comfortable to relax many of these assumptions, which have been widely used in a more, quote, dogmatic way. And I'll mention one of those. Uh, um, a sort of atomism of more an individualism, assuming that each individual makes their own maximization of utility of what they wanted without being imposed by others. That is the classic definition, that classic definition of economics omits learning. Learning is the core of psychology. I got a BA in psychology, and I studied that, and I hated it because it was rats, and people at that point studied learning through rats. And so I said, I'm leaving this damn discipline of psychology. I don't want to study rats. I want to study bigger, more complicated, subtle things. But the point is, learning is something which the economists in those days said, economics doesn't learn any. We leave it, quote unquote, to other disciplines like sociology, anthropology, psychology, other fields. So me working back and forth, but trying to take the best work from the economists and from sociology and from political science and put these together as we're doing in this course now, you can see the strengths as well as the problems. I'll mention quickly in passing the second name I mentioned, George Stigler. He loved to take photographs, and he took lots and lots of photographs of the workshops when we were talking and arguing things. And the workshop used to be the fourth floor of the social science research building, was the economics workshop, and all the walls were covered with wonderful photos that George either took himself or he brought there. My point is, that's part of art. That Stigler was bringing the arts together in ways that uh, others had not articulated. Later, this has changed, and so I mentioned here with people on the faculty, and so with Gary Becker there, nevertheless, we had these more senior people attacking when we had, say, David Galenson presenting how, or let me just mention, there three senior faculty in the economics department did papers on the prices of art, especially paintings, and they would analyze data over time, often, um, for all of paintings in the world, or then they would maybe get the name of the painter, and that was often that was thought to be, very fancy, substantively informed analysis. Not much art history, but it just had the name, like Picasso versus Degas. Okay. Ed Glaeser said, this is useless. That is, there were other people in the room who'd published papers that did basically that, or simplified things. And Glaeser, in turn, was then attacked by some of the senior people who usually didn't do anything, did not work anything, did not do any work to do with the arts, and they would say, "What's your evidence?" And then he would say, "Here is a letter which Picasso wrote in 1907, and I will read to you 3 sentences." And I'd never before or afterward heard, a quotation of a letter from an artist like Picasso. But then what he was doing, why was he quoting this? He was joining the big idea of innovation and where and why does innovation change? And he, in his case, I changed from giving up one style of painting to another. And so Picasso went through five, six, seven, multiple types of stages of blocks and of triangles and of people's feet going upside down and into their mouths and things like this. I mean, he had certain kinds of things which everyone that we first when he started doing it, just, oh wow, Picasso really has a whole new approach to art. And then the prices went way up. So what he has done, what he did was then to analyze the different stages of Picasso as he went from studying blocks to feet to women leaning forward to one another, et cetera, and then traced and where and why these things went up and down as a way of measuring innovation through the prices. And I'll just mention in passing that when Gary Becker himself did his PhD, he didn't introduce, but uh, he used human capital. Nice big term. It joins the capital concept of economics with something more concrete, which was the number of years of education. So education, he then wanted to bring in as an indicator way of measuring human capital, which also could be a way of combining analytically um, land, labor, management, kinds of traditional factors of production could be transformed by using more efficient use of of human capital. This in turn leads to the idea of innovation in a more sensitive way, linking to more core concepts of economic theorizing. That basically is my quick point. Nevertheless, what you see now, and I'll flash forward briefly to say the generally widely regarded as the leading urban economist is a student of Gary Becker, and I can say of me for a little bit while he was a student here, and he's been most of his career he's been at Harvard, but he's come back regularly to Chicago for workshops, discussions. When people got a Nobel Prize, he'd come here for dinner and so forth. So Ed Glaeser, uh, uh, I want to introduce because of a good to give you to ask a parable or not and ask a hard question. When the city of New Orleans was destroyed basically by flooding at the end of the Mississippi River, was some 20 years ago, something like that. What should be done to help it? The U.S. national government went and visited the president, others were saying, we want to help the state of Louisiana. We want to help especially this city. But how should we do this? And this was a huge battle going on in Washington and in the media and so forth. And Ed Glaeser's strong position, clear and strong, was don't give money to the politicians because it will be wasted. Give it to the citizens and let them use their money however they choose to do so. And if they want to take their money and move and leave New Orleans and move to Houston or Chicago and leave the whole city away, so be it. Okay, that's a pretty wild position to take. And I'll add briefly, Ed, uh, um, Glaeser's own father was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So Glaeser grew up surrounded by the art and of aesthetics, but he has not pursued it. Okay, so Glaeser could play boorish non-artist, but he's not quite as subtle as he's not as crude as he can play. The point of that is a big point I want you to take away, please. How can we define the arts transforms a lot when we're talking about a painting on the wall. If it's a painting on the wall and you don't show it to anybody else except people who visit you for dinner now and then, it's a private good. It belongs to you. It can be bought and sold as a private good, like a pair of shoes or a house. What if we have public art and painters who are now saying we want to have a choreography dancing along the whole Mississippi River in unison? That's public art. How can we then connect that with this new conception of art as a public phenomenon? The answer I'm suggesting is these are both correct. They're different kinds of art. And instead of just talking about art, I mean, there are multiple ways, and I'm not saying any one of these are right or wrong. I'm saying we've got a lot of writing about these things now, from philosophy, from from history, etc. But to make sense of these, when is to classify them into types. If we want to build models, for instance, of the price of a painting or prices of all of the paintings of Picasso, and then how these change, or if we're dealing with the value of land, of the value of a house in a city, whether it's in Chicago or let's say Montreal or New Orleans. Montreal, I'm choosing because many think of it, it's in the center of French Quebecois, the French speaking strong part of Canada is Montreal. You drive there, you look at it, you visit Montreal, and you look at the downtown area. You could just as well be in parts of Philadelphia or New York or Chicago. That is, there's almost nothing in its architecture that it's visibly French. When you went to the past, to New Orleans, before it was flooded, it had hundreds of years of tradition from Spain and from France before it became part of the United States. And so that, and the museum of the city of New Orleans had celebrated all kinds of things in it. For instance, so they visibly showed about themselves and to visitors. The men here in New Orleans seem to be interested in two things: horseback riding and dancing. Horseback riding and dancing? This is not traditional macho style definitions of masculinity. And how and where could this connect with other things elsewhere? I won't try to elaborate. Simply that the simple point I'm making is New Orleans had a strong, distinctive cultural meaning as a city, celebrated in its own museum of the city of New Orleans, very different from Montreal or Chicago or any other city in the US. And in that sense, that strong case to have Ed Glaeser say, give the citizens the money and let them leave the whole thing there, in a sense, is let's destroy the culture of the city of New Orleans. That is his definition of utility maximization of the citizens, omits in this example, the city level. I won't just say who has the power to do so, to set the budget or whatever. That's the government. But what's there in the minds of the individuals as tourists, for instance, in the past and as now today, when people go to New Orleans for a convention, they may be checking in a hotel, and you may have a band outside of 100 jazz musicians in the street playing jazz. You don't get this in any other city in the US. I mean, the sense of music, of art, and of Faulkner lived there for a while to articulate New Orleans. Okay, so what I don't want to go on too long here. Let's see, we got no, we're doing okay. The 46 minutes I have here, so I want to join some of these big points. Transformation of culture away from just being national identity like Germany or France to become more fragmented into concepts like romanticism and classicism, and that in turn broke up into transgression. So we had in the late 19th century the widely used term bohemian. And so bohemian was even used in a famous Italian La Boheme, uh, taking that term from a French novel, I believe, or short story. It was a concept which was very popular among the the uh, the French and Italians at the end of the 19th century. I mentioned as we introduced Walter Benjamin, who was considered by many the leading German intellectual at the time, wanted us to answer for himself. If we have German culture, we built Germany from our culture. How is this really changed in conjunction with Paris? Paris never had industry, as I pointed out. They started to build industries. They said, no smoke in Paris. They managed to be successful because of entertainment. I won't just say art narrowly, but entertainment, including wine, women and song, dancing, shows, clothes, food, aesthetics, designing of cars, etc. These sorts of things, and the Italians and the French both had many of these concerns for bringing a table or an automobile or a chair, not just something you sit on and that works to sit on, but also that it has an aesthetic appeal, a higher price, and that this was done with great success by the okay. uh, this aesthetic sensitivity. Benjamin tried to say, where did this come from? And he focused on his main source, as I've told you, was to look at the leading poet of these years, who was Baudrillard. Okay, so I'm sorry. Benjamin, the German. uh, Balzac was the novelist at the beginning of the century. And we put these together at the end of the 19th century. And the aesthetics of trying to understand the street, the uh, the river, the the aspects of aesthetics were what Benjamin wanted to distill. Reading poetry and then trying to transform it more into, in his case, he was explicitly so-called Marxist. How could you combine this? He did. And then what did I show what he did by adding innovation within Marxism was the flaneur, the shopper, the the cravat or the umbrella gentleman wanted to be able to shop, but it was raining on over these little shops, so they put arcades on top of the shops, and the glass made it possible, which in turn, at the end of the 19th century, became the department store, and then became in the 20th century the mall. These combinations of multiple brands and multiple aesthetic combinations of shoes and um, uh, clothes, tables, desks, etc., in ways that these were transforming the meaning of what would have been earlier prices based on preferences, one could say. How could we then join this with Chicago economics? I mentioned Gary Becker, human capital, adding education. Another big piece of this was it was really by several people around Gary Becker, but uh, one of the best papers was by Ed Glaeser on amenities. And an amenity, the simple economic definition, is a non-market good or service. And it's something which people may have in their preference function. That is, you could say you want to have, I'd like to have X, 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 X1, X2, X3, X4. I'd like to have these things, and I can buy these. I'll have a car, I'll have and these are private goods that I can buy. I can put on my wall, or I can have a car a Ferrari in my garage. Those private goods are there. But when we get to clean air or being safe, of having people shooting in your street, security, having a more ecologically friendly surrounding, these things make, and Glaeser has even suggested, for urban economic analysis, amenities are more important than market goods and services. That's a pretty strong statement. Amenities are major drivers. Okay, so you have a field. So example, police, education, crime, buses, these things for sure, these make a huge difference. But to say them from an economist, he did another paper just to say he wrote this, I would say, a dogmatic, narrow paper on New Orleans. But he's a brilliant guy. He published a paper on happiness. He took some of the data we have from the National Opinion Research Center, where we started our city study, the public permanent community sample of PCS, and city money. We had these data on happiness because we had data from citizens across the whole U.S. national sample, and we had cities. What Ed Glaeser did was to analyze happiness. So economists didn't touch this for 20, 30 years. So, oh, no, that's for sociologists, psychologists. But it's not really science. That was reversed. That was reversed by the work of Ed Glaeser. Not just him, many others did the same thing. But what he did was to publish a paper with about 100 independent variables to say what are the causes of happiness. But he put in income, occupation, education, race. These many things he put together were more standard. You're getting a message, you send that we should. Okay.
Yeah, we have to change it.
Sorry? You're just cold? Okay. let me push on here. We got we have 55 minutes, so we should go for about 20 more minutes. Are you comfortable? You want to close a window or anything where you are somehow? Okay. Um, yeah. If you just close the window, is that enough for you to keep warmer? Is that the issue, or is there something else? Yeah, I
Just
don't. So I'll just keep going if I think you're there, and it says okay.
so we can still continue.
Okay, thank you. The What I'm going through is how the arts can be analyzed scientifically, and I'm using examples of how economics has done so. And the example I'm using from economic concepts from this department, under the leadership with Friedman and then Gary Becker, would be to include um, and to be able to hire and appoint and promote a full professors here within the economics department or related in the law and business uh, and so forth, where the economists, they would include increasingly the arts. But one of these was to label it, how can we analyze an amenity which is not sold sometimes, that is, let me back up. I want to join you now with Paul Samuelson. Remember, Samuelson was there telling those London people, what you're doing is not science. You're just telling people to, spend more money on this or that for London because we think it's nice. But you don't have any economics to tell you why this really is scientifically valid. How can one find some answers to this? The economists here started, in the late 20th century, said, how can we measure the value of amenities? Instead of just saying they're important, how can we measure them? And so what they started to do was to analyze things like the value of the price of land or the price of a house or the rent you pay for an apartment. These kinds of market sold and bought products and services could then be compared across metro areas. Or that is, the economists, the best data they had at that point was metro areas. We've now gone down to zip codes and we've gone down to points. So we can get to that with the new Google data and other kinds of things. But the point is, if we can get the price of land for a particular small area, we can then, and we have millions of these, we have many combinations of variables together, like the average person's living in the nearby or on that block or in that neighborhood. Are they rich or poor, black or white, highly educated, less educated? And what is the price of their land? What is the price of their home? And these then factors are then could be, and this is what they did in this methodology, was to say, let's estimate the price of, say, the square foot of office space in a downtown city, and then compare the price of a square foot of office space in New York or LA or Kansas City. And that's a measure of the value of having office space, which can be then also used even if you don't pay rent. So then that could be given to, imposed or forced to pay by say, a university, which doesn't pay normally taxes to the city of Chicago for if you're a private university, for example, or a nonprofit organization that has volunteers, or a hospital that is not trying to make money. What's the value that you should negotiate? If you're the mayor, how should you negotiate a fair price? And the answer was to estimate what it would be for that square foot if it were office space rented at the market price. That's, I mean, I'm skipping the fancy math and all of that, but the core idea is there and fairly straightforward. It requires, however, comparison. Lots of different units, lots of combinations of variables that join together in different ways in different locales. And so if we have roughly 35,000 zip codes in the US, these vary a lot in the combination of whether you have Catholics or Jews or people from Ireland or Irish Catholics or Irish Protestants and so forth. And so by using these, my answer is not to use any one of these, because when we say, what is art? My answer is art is at all of these levels. Art can be an amenity. Art can be private paintings can be bought or sold, but a painting is not a public art, which is a choreography along the entire Mississippi River by people who are not paid any money at all. They're doing this because they love to dance. So that's an amenity in a pure sense. So how to measure those and to try to measure those amenities for different kinds of arts are what is required by adding more characteristics, defining not just, is it big or small, or is it blue or white? Is it abstract or whatever? Yes, we need all those characteristics that art historians and arts departments, or film departments, uh, rhetoric departments analyze. Those variables are certainly important to retain as ever. But if we join them, as the classic real estate question is, you know, where? Which next to whom? Don't just tell me it's a pretty house. In which neighborhood? Who are your neighbors? Those are major drivers of, and then one of the uh, um, consequences of this is how you precisely model this. And this in turn, I'll just, with a flash at least, mention a critical point is the size of the unit. And if from a measurement standpoint, an ideal best is 1 point measured by geographic latitude and longitude. And we can say this is where this point is. And from a statistical standpoint, we can build maps. For making maps, that's great. Maps don't tell us how the variables are interrelated the way that we can now do with some statistical models, such as HLM, or mixed level modeling, as these terms are variously used. And these can then say, if we want to say, what's the price of a Picasso painting, which is in a public square in the city of Chicago, right down there, and there are a lot of people looking at it, how much is the fact that that was a Picasso sculpture higher, and how much is it because it's in downtown Chicago in those particular streets? How might that change if it were further north or south or whatever? These are the kinds of things which have to be done. And if we have the variations in different kinds of data, and we've got lots of Picasso paintings and Picasso sculptures in different places, we can look at how much value is added to different stages of the work of Picasso, as well as use that in conjunction with other kinds of works of art, which are potentially raising the value of land in downtown Chicago. Okay, so here's another point which I'll point to as an interesting overlap. Jane Jacobs and Jane Jacobs had written her hugely impactful book on the death and life, whatever it's called, the life and death of American cities, stressing innovation. And that was, I don't know, 10, 20 years before Ed Glaeser came along. Glaeser did a paper where he then looked at three different kinds of innovation. So he took Jane Jacobs, a couple of others, I've forgotten exactly what, but he concluded that the best way of analyzing innovation was done by Jane Jacobs in his quantitative mathematical testing using large scale data. And that's a famous, valuable paper. However, when he's written and talked about her, they've had many disagreements. So, in particular, she features the sidewalk where people can have, say, a little open opening up of an open street bookstore where people can sell books, or they can have paintings, or they can sit in a chair and draw a picture of a painting right there. And Greenwich Village does this in detail, which she went and she elaborated this and is well known and was the Latin Quarter version of the United States for 50 years, whatever. Now we have these all over the world. But at the point, it was an extreme bohemian neighborhood. Ed Glaeser, sensitive to these issues, said, this is not the right way to build a city, as to have people doing a lot of stuff just in these sidewalks. I mean, the reason, so he pointed out, for instance, which cities in the US have the best. I'm looking here. I have an hour and 7 minutes in terms of my timing here. In terms of um, the efficiency of environmental use of scarce resources, especially, say, gasoline, um, today. Which energy consumption is the most efficient city in the United States? New York. Why? Because it has the highest high-rise buildings and the most dense population. And that has led to the more efficient use of heating, having the heat of one building instead of having 20,000 little houses, each of which has its own heater, its own windows that are leaking, and so forth. And in that way, Glaeser has one of his main points. He's only published one book, which is a collection mostly of newspaper editorials and so forth. But his big point he makes again and again and again is to say high density buildings are what we really want. New York is a wonderful example. And we then have a contrast internationally, then as a sections where he says, I then took a trip to China and then to India. And China, they've got the message. Shanghai, they've got high-rise buildings. India, no. 3, 4, 5, 6 stories. And they have the worst traffic in the world. They have the worst pollution in India because they have so many cars cranking out all this stuff into the air, and they should get the message. They got this from the late 19th century English. The garden image of the architecture, which was surrounded with little trees and little things, was great in London in 1880 and so forth. But it doesn't work for more and more people. Okay, so Glaeser's, that's point one of Glaeser. Point two of Glaeser is New York has lots more sensitive regulations to control the aesthetics of zoning and practices for where and how you can get a building permit, where and how there's certain criteria which are aesthetically defined. And then others may be not narrowly aesthetic, they may also have health. They may have neighbors who live nearby. That is, there are lots of committees and commissions that must weigh in before a new building can be constructed, or a certain way of doing these sorts of things. And then here, Glaeser will then contrast, well, the great city here is not New York, it's, guess who? Chicago. We have the lowest of a major city office space per square foot price. We've got an efficient market, more so than New York or LA. And so in this way, Glaeser loves to celebrate the example of Chicago's lack of these regulations. And so it's an extension of his sort of point about, that is, the hell with the aesthetics of New Orleans or of downtown Chicago, or let's say the downtown New York. You can do it in different ways. So these are more general points, which are obviously not unique to these 3 or 4 cities, but Shanghai and Delhi and the like are important. And these are bigger concepts like amenities, scenes we've read about, and where and how these join together the energies of different neighborhoods and different cities and their distinctive dynamics. Okay, so what I've done in these comments is to join the aesthetics of art with the social science concepts, which, where and how, especially I'm using economics variables, because this is you would say, other things equal, the hardest to come to this mathematized, most coherent, structured discipline in its propositions and its mathematization. At the same time, that it has also embraced within and via concepts like, both Anthony Downes's An Economic Theory of Democracy has destroyed traditional political science and has brought in a Buchanan and Tullock sensitivity to demand and supply, and having models of people thinking and using economic ways of thinking and modeling their equations in their journal called Public Choice, and where and how these then, through the studies of actual simple, obviously artistic works such as Picasso's, but let me generalize a little bit more to say, as to link this to what we know in this whole course. That is, the point of the idea of scene is not just about a painting on a wall. A scene, and what we've then done, as you recall, is not to take an amenity, that is, the amenity is, as analyzed by Ed Glaeser and company, is to assume, as usual, atomism. We want to study cafes, and then they'll count the number of cafes in a city. But that ignores the fact that cafes may have power and value in the price of a coffee cup based on where that cafe is adjacent to, who else is in the scene. And if you are next to Wall Street, you pay more than if you are in a poor Black neighborhood in Bronzeville in Chicago. Okay, so these kinds of differences in terms of market prices, and linking these with the amenities, have aesthetic power to transform the political system. To use that one example, let's start to use the three. Scenes redefine the value of a house, and in that chapter in Scenescapes, in that chapter on the economy. In the chapter on politics, the voters and the parties and the elections and the civic organizations, which are analyzed in that chapter, can be combined together, and these build a political scene. Not just to have the voter alone in a voting booth tells you nothing about politics. So, in that sense, I would say those persons who've only analyzed voting in that way without adding competition, freedom of entry, parties, party competition, the rules of regulation, and where these things fit together, and to build the dynamics of a political scene gives its meaning, such as federalism or dictatorial or fascist. These are coherent social science concepts as well as hot ideological labels these days. So in the other sections, I'm simply saying urban studies as part of geography or as part of architecture, where people are not such a central focus. Each of these can be linked together more carefully if we look at some of their empirically at some of their quote dynamics in the sense of what drives a price up or down, what drives people to move away or to from New Orleans or way to or from Chicago or uh, a suburban area, and what about a specific suburb that makes it different from others. Um, so these are, if you will, mechanisms for joining together in our social science, and whether or not you're doing this original research yourself, you having had this course, aware of these concepts, you can use these, and you, if you're working as a mayor or an assistant consultant for helping analyze these sorts of things as a BA, not even an MA or a PhD, you can be sensitive to these issues and then ask for or invite when you write a request for proposals, when you want to have a new hospital, assess the way in which its taxation may be too high. Maybe you're paying too much to the city of Chicago. If you're a hospital, I'm adjacent to two hospitals, both were closed down. They ran out of money. And where and how those prices and how much they had to pay to the city of Chicago was part of those bankruptcies of hospitals. Um, Same thing with right now that we're having elections and of the public schools as well as the charter schools, and how much the charter schools have to either get money from the city of Chicago or have to pay to exist in conjunction with the public schools. This is a hot issue right now, illustrating the ways that these things are interpenetrating in ways that we have now tools for analyzing amenities, such as things you don't have to pay for. But I'll then add another big aspect, which we haven't stressed enough. I haven't stressed today, but which I will say, can be an alternative to money, is emotion. That is what brings people to feel more powerfully. I vote for or against Trump. I'm vote for or against Lionel Robinson in my neighborhood, and so forth. That is the alderman, the mayor. These emotional feelings can be mobilized by people through art and through bringing the music. And this was seen as one of the reasons by the current mayor managed to beat the potential in the last final campaign of that election. The candidate that was supported by the police, by the Republicans, but by a majority of Chicago's citizens in the surveys was the man who lost. So the emotions, perhaps, many suggest that the last 2 weeks led to the creation of new music and the mobilization and the labeling of the police as linked with racist and irresponsible etc. So I won't bring in any such words as I've tried to. I'm bringing them in two or three here near the end of this session today, simply to say that the arts can bring in emotions in ways that voting or cash in the old days, pay for money and we'll give you votes. Give us your votes and we'll give you cash, etc. Those kinds of exchanges are being this is now labeled corruption. It's the old Irish style. And in that way, instead, we have the importance of public goods, of which art can be a major example in transforming the value of housing, streets, cities, and one of the largest industries in the world today, either number one or number three, depending on how you do the accounting, is tourism. Within China, within France, within the US, China is a middle. It's not a poor country anymore, but it's not the highest level of income. But even within China, tourism is a major business and part of the economy in ways that make these salient kinds of concerns. But they need tools. We need analytical tools to help government and planners and others who are not using markets to try to see where and how these kinds of things can attract people to visit a cultural park of the sort we've talked about here. All right, I will end with those comments. As we've joined this, we'll have a session on Wednesday. We'll continue with anything that you'd like to discuss in preparation for the exam. But most of all, it gives you an opportunity to review your notes, your pieces of how they fit together. We have the date of the exam I've sent out. It was Thursday of in the exam week. I'm Yushan, I won't ask you to just say it now. It's not everyone will necessarily see it here, but it's in writing and it's clear for the exam the week after that. But anything that I have deliberately not used the material that we might have tried to show because I had things which I wanted to bring in so I apologized for you
Yeah,
being
that's fine. That's fine.
being there with your
Um,
cold jacket on. But anything to raise as a question or comment on procedures for the course now?
I think do not have any question. Just like I'm currently to prepare the final exam material, so maybe I will send this lately.
Very good.
Mhm.
Okay, we will confer again and meet class in the same. Well, let's hope it will be closer to our normally scheduled time. But the way we've got it here, and it's will be online at YouTube. And I think remind me, it should be now on my machine locally.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
And yeah, I think both of us have a local record.
okay. Thank you very much, and
Mhm.
I will click on.
So